Last month, we here in the United States had midterm elections. As I'm sure most of you know, the red wave that seemed so likely, and that so many people predicted, turned out to be more of a red trickle. Republicans actually lost ground in the Senate and in the state houses. Not all was a loss for the red team, though. The GOP did take the House of Representatives, albeit not by the margins many, including me, expected. Oddly enough, the state where they made the most impressive gains was in New York, where Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1. Republicans gained 4 seats in the New York delegation, putting them over the top for a slim House majority. How did this happen? Well, as always, there are a number of reasons. Democrats did not redistrict in a way that was maximally advantageous, despite the fact that they held the governorship, state assembly, and state senate. Also, Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul ran a lackluster statewide re-election campaign. Even though she won, Lee Zeldin, her Republican opponent, seemed to inspire his supporters more, which helped the Republicans down ballot. But perhaps the biggest factor was the issue of crime. As the Financial Times reports, one issue has been particularly salient in the post-mortem of the Democrats' stumble in New York. Crime, said veteran Democratic strategist Hank Sheenkampf. Fear of New York City spilling into the suburbs. According to a Quinnipiac University poll in late October, crime was the top issue for New York voters, with respondents placing it well ahead of inflation and protecting democracy. Abortion rights may have been less of a factor in New York than elsewhere, because they are enshrined in the state's constitution. Lee Zeldin, the Republican candidate for governor, made public safety the central focus of an unexpectedly robust campaign. He ended up losing by 5.8 percentage points to Hochul, who was thrust into the governor's mansion late last year, only after her predecessor, Andrew Cuomo, resigned in a cloud of scandal. Crime is a divisive issue on the left. While most online leftists agree that there should be reform in our criminal justice system, the nature of that reform and the scope of the crime problem itself are the subjects of heated debate.
It's also worth noting, by the way, that gun violence is at a record high in this country this year. I'm not saying that. The stats are saying that. So for all of the crime deniers, just sit down, take a deep breath, and get a load of the statistics I'm about to read you. Because are we gonna do anything about this? So gun violence is part of the crime wave that for some reason, some portion of the country wants to pretend like is not happening. And it's driving me crazy because it is happening. Innocent people are dying. Innocent people are being assaulted. Innocent people are being raped.
Crime has been a loser for the Democrats in the past. That is, until they started to take a harder line on it, particularly in the 90s. You can bash Joe Biden for writing the crime bill all you want. When it was passed, crime rates were very high, and Americans were clamoring for federal action. I don't know what Democrats will do in response to this recent crime uptick, but if they don't at least give the impression that they're doing something, they'll probably continue to lose races they would otherwise win. You see, the thing about crime is that it's actually something that inspires political action within the electorate. I suspect this is because it really impacts people on a visceral, emotional, and practical level, and it does so every day. This is somewhat unique in politics, as a lot of the issues that politicians concern themselves with aren't something that impacts the day-to-day lives of most of their constituents. For example, there are real-world consequences to the aid and weapons the US is sending to Ukraine. These consequences just aren't felt directly or immediately by voters. Hence, the question of whether we should send another multi-billion-dollar aid package is pretty much just an abstraction to most voters. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the biggest story of 2020, and it could lead to a direct war, perhaps even a nuclear war, between Russia and the United States. But it hardly registered in the midterms as an issue. As of now, it's just too out of sight and out of mind for most Americans. This is not the case with crime. The sorts of things that people read in headlines or see on the local news could happen to them on any day. If anything, we're oversensitive to this issue. According to Gallup, the vast majority of Americans have consistently thought that crime has increased since 1990. Crime is higher than it was just a few years ago, but it's still down from the early 1990s, when it was historically high. In fact, during that stretch from 1990 to 2020, violent crime fell in all but 7 years, and property crime fell in all but 2 years. In other words, most of the public's perception of crime is pretty much backwards. There is a massive negativity bias when it comes to this issue. This isn't to say that crime isn't a real problem. It clearly is, and if there's one problem the government should be dealing with, it's this one. Nor is this to say that tough on crime measures aren't good or don't work. It's that we as human beings are not that great at assessing danger in general. And one of the more politically consequential forms of this is that voters are biased towards tough on crime politicians. Exactly what we should do about crime, I honestly don't know. There are people who know this issue much better than I do, so I suggest you look to them. I bring this up now because it's something that inherently registers with voters. The task of many rhetoricians and political operatives is to try to communicate abstract issues in ways that are more understandable to voters on a level that crime inherently is. For example, it's one thing to say that inflation is 8%. Even though that's incredibly important and impacts people's day-to-day lives, it's a statistical abstraction that doesn't really register with anybody on a practical level. Now, compare that to talking about how much more Thanksgiving dinner costs. Even though the latter is a less accurate picture of inflation, as Thanksgiving dinner primarily concerns only one sector of the economy, agriculture and food production, it's a useful proxy for the issue politically because it turns this abstraction into something more tangible. Errors made from extrapolating tangible experiences to general trends are made in other areas of politics as well. If you recall, in a previous video, I played a clip from economist Adam Posen, where he talked about how losses in manufacturing jobs register with the electorate in a way that other economic changes don't.
But when I look at the so-called costs of the China shock or the costs of the decline in manufacturing, I always think compared to what? For decades, there was enormous displacement of African Americans in this economy. Every time there was a recession, African American unemployment rates shot up much faster and higher than white unemployment rates. Single women were methodically excluded from the workforce, and especially if they became parents, or ghettoed in particular sets of jobs throughout the economy well through the 70s into the 80s. Displacements on large scales would happen when technology or trade broke through, like all the secretaries who got replaced by personal computers and other forms of office automation, excuse me. And these kinds of churn, as the economists put it, never were decried. They never got political attention. They never got much notice. But when it started being the white male manufacturing people in the so-called heartland, which by definition was not urban, then suddenly this was a crisis.
I believe that one of the reasons we do this is because, like crime, we have exaggerated notions of how much outsourcing has happened compared to other economic changes. And we make this mistake for a similar reason. The losses to manufacturing jobs from outsourcing are more tangible and immediate than other economic changes. Voters are similarly misinformed about the status of manufacturing in the same way that they are misinformed about crime. As Pew Research discovered, 4 out of every 5 Americans, 81%, know that the total number of manufacturing jobs in the US has decreased over the past 3 decades. According to the survey of 4,135 adults from Pew Research Center's nationally representative American Trends panel. But just 35% know that the nation's manufacturing output has risen over the same time span, versus 47% who say that output has decreased and 17% who say it has stayed the same. Only 26% of those surveyed got both questions right. There's good reason to believe that one of these is directly related to the other. The decrease in manufacturing jobs is far more visible to someone than is increased output. I was born in a Rust Belt city myself, and was raised on stories about how they used to make X, Y, and Z here, and now all you see is a rusted out abandoned building. Now compare that to manufacturing output of the country as a whole. That's pretty much impossible to visualize. This is one of the conclusions that Pew came to as well. One of the reasons Americans may be more familiar with the long-term decline in manufacturing employment than the increase in output is that the job losses have been highly visible, especially in traditionally manufacturing-intensive areas of the Midwest and the South. Also, I believe that for the same reasons, people are similarly misled about the causes of decline in American manufacturing employment. Why does a smaller percentage of our labor force work in factories than did in previous decades? Few people would dispute that outsourcing and automation have both contributed to that. Which one is a bigger factor, though? The numbers say automation, and it's not particularly close. According to the American Economic Review, it is widely accepted that U.S. manufacturing decline has been limited to employment, and that these losses were primarily caused by productivity gains, not trade. Indeed, even the most pessimistic academic studies on imports and manufacturing jobs have found only a limited connection between the two. Autor, Dorn, and Hansen found in 2013, for example, that import competition explains only 1/4 of contemporaneous aggregate decline in U.S. manufacturing employment between 1990 and 2007. Other studies have been more sanguine. For example, a recent Ball State study attributed almost 90% of all U.S. manufacturing job losses since 2000 to productivity gains. Had we kept 2000 levels of productivity and applied them to 2010 levels of production, the authors write, we would have required 20.9 million manufacturing workers. Instead, we employed only 12.1 million. Thus, it is simply wrong to blame import competition for the disappearance of American manufacturing jobs or the supposed destruction of U.S. industrial capacity. Again, none of this is to say that outsourcing or closures from import competition haven't happened. They certainly have, and they've been consequential. It's that automation and efficiency gains are far more responsible for changes in industry. The reason why most people have the opposite view is because the former is far more visible than the latter. When a factory closes, it sits there as an eyesore for all the country to see. Talented rhetoricians can use this to invoke powerful imagery and feelings of loss.
Rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation.
Compare this to efficiency gains. In 1980, it took 10.1 man-hours to produce a ton of steel. In 2017, it took only 1.5. That's an 85% reduction. How does one visualize that? What does that look like for a voter, practically speaking? Well, for starters, it's over a long time span, so you're very unlikely to notice anything immediately. Over that time span, this just means that a steel mill is going to hire fewer people while pumping out more product. That's not exactly the sort of thing that registers with people. Another reason why foreign competition weighs so heavily on the American mind is that the stuff your average American buys, with the exception of groceries, is more likely to be subject to foreign competition. Import competition is much greater in consumer goods than it is for industrial goods. When you go to Walmart or Target to buy Christmas presents, you'll see lots of Made in China labels. Meanwhile, most of American manufacturing has shifted to high value-added capital goods and inputs. In other words, we don't make a lot of t-shirts and tennis shoes anymore, but we do make lots of synthetic chemicals and machinery. Because your average voter is more likely to encounter something foreign-made on a day-to-day basis, they're more likely to come away with a false perception that we simply don't make things anymore at all. Couple this with the fact that fewer people work in the manufacturing sector, hence you're less likely to know someone who works in a factory, and you get a very skewed sense of what's really going on. Again, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but whenever I talk about this, there are some people who always seem to miss this point. None of this is to say that outsourcing hasn't happened, or that it hasn't had negative consequences. Of course, both of those things are true. It's that, like crime, our perception of things tends to be off. And our misperception has political ramifications. Also, none of this is to defend the trade policy of the last 40 years. If you watch this channel regularly, you know that I have a lot to say about that. Where we go wrong, why we do what we do, and what we can do to help American manufacturing going forward, as well as further misperceptions voters may have, are all things that I'll be talking about in the future. Take care and stay tuned.